I'm very excited to say welcome everyone to our sixth Computing Education Research Centre meeting. I'm Jane Waite. I'm hosting the session today, and this seminar series this year we are focusing on applied AI, and it's this idea that it's not just about us computer scientists kind of pushing AI into other subjects. Instead, it's looking at how other disciplines have done research and are looking at how AI can be integrated in the arts, the sciences, and the humanities. And today I'm incredibly delighted to welcome Gianfranco Polizzi from the University of Birmingham as our speaker. And when I kind of was looking around for people who are doing important work in other topics or other disciplines around AI, Franco's work immediately became important because he has presented to select committees, he is creating recommendations, and his work on media literacy really is having an enormous impact on curriculum and policy. So I'm very excited that he's here today. As I said before, I am very excited and pleased to introduce Franco Polizzi from the University of Birmingham. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics and Communication, and his research examines how different groups develop and deploy the skills and knowledge they need to navigate online risks and opportunities to participate in a digital society. He's currently co-leading a Nuffield funded project examining the effectiveness of media literacy pedagogies on the well-being of secondary students. Isn't that an incredibly important thing to be doing right now? As well as a project funded by the Institute of Data and AI, where he's exploring AI use among young people aged 18 to 25 in relationship to their mental health and well-being. In the seminar today, Gianfranco will draw on relevant research and evidence to examine the concept of media literacy and its importance in the age of AI, while also considering related and overlapping concepts such as AI literacy. He's going to highlight some gaps, and these are persistent gaps in media literacy across the UK population, along with some of the challenges involved in equipping both children and adults with the skills they need to thrive in this rapidly changing digital society. And lastly, he will present evidence-based recommendations for future research, which is very important to us, policy, and for all the teachers here, practice as well. So, Gianfranco, very excited to have you. So over to you.
Thank you for the great introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you for the invite. So yes, I'd like to today to talk about media literacy in the age of AI. That's the title of the presentation, because I'd like to really focus on an area of interest to me, which is media literacy, something that I've researched for quite some time now within applied areas in different areas. But today, really, I want to focus on also that relationship between media literacy and AI literacy. So I'll start conceptually by talking about those terms. And I will then also spend a few minutes just talking about why media literacy is important. And then I will really focus on some of the evidence that we have about the UK population, particularly in talking about media literacy. I will draw on different projects that I have run and collect myself in the last few years. And when discussing the evidence, I will also draw on a very recent project, a current project that I'm working on, the one funded by the IDA Institute. I will then also spend a little bit of time just talking about some of the challenges and the issues that relate to the provision of media literacy education in the UK, with a focus on policy and practice, to then end with a few practical and policy related recommendations. So traditionally, the term literacy refers to the ability to read and write. However, the term literacy is often used within specific contexts to refer more broadly to a set of skills, knowledge, and attitudes, and I'd say practices as well, that people possess and deploy within certain specific contexts. So we hear about things like cultural literacy, financial literacy, health literacy, to refer to, again, the kind of set of skills, practices, knowledge that people are supposed to have to navigate certain environments, whether it's a cultural environment or a financial environment. And I think the same can be said for media literacy specifically. I'm going to use here a definition that is widely accepted and widely used, at least in the UK, which is a definition provided by Ofcom, the independent regulator in this country, which defines media literacy as the ability to use, understand, and create media and communications across multiple formats and services. Now, in my work and in the work of other scholars in this field too, media literacy is often understood as an umbrella term. So it's generally understood as an overarching sort of concept that relates to both traditional media, and by that I mean, radio, TV, advertising, press, but also to digital technologies, digital media, right? And I make a distinction here between digital technologies being devices, technologies, and media, the kind of content that circulates through those devices. Now, obviously, terms such as digital, data, and obviously now also AI literacies are really related to media literacy. They overlap with media literacy, and there are certain aspects that obviously that you find in all of those different types of literacies, if you will, right? So digital literacy in itself is a form or is a type of media literacy that specifically relates to digital technologies and digital media. And in my own work and in the work of others, digital literacy is often approached as twofold, if you will. So in my own work, I talk about functional digital literacy, and I also talk about critical digital literacy. What do I mean by those terms? So functional digital literacy incorporates, practical digital skills. By that, I mean like the technical, the operational, information navigation, creative, social related to using social media skills that people need to possess in order to be able to use these technologies. So it can go from something really basic as knowing how to use a mouse all the way to producing something, creating content. Then there's also knowledge of affordances, which is understanding the technical features of digital devices, the internet, digital technology. So what do those features look like? What do they enable you to do? What do they not enable you to do? And then also understanding the sort of benefits, the pros and cons of, using these technologies, but from a more kind of individualistic perspective. So, using a particular device because, it helps with efficiency, it saves time, for example, or it presents some risks. That's what I normally categorize as components, aspects that are really relevant to functional digital literacy. On the other hand, we have another very important dimension to media literacy, to digital literacy, which is the criticality that comes with it. Now, you'd be surprised to see how, be surprised to know that there are lots of discussions around what that criticality is supposed to look like, and there are also a lot of discussions that have to do with how politicized that criticality can be. But to break it down, at least in line with my own approach to critical digital literacy, I'd say that for me, there are three important components, if you will, that are crucial to critical digital literacy. One has to do with being able to evaluate online content, and that traditionally sits within media literacy as a concept. You find it in critical digital literacy too, and there are different approaches to it, including, for example, a critical pedagogy approach that is very much not just about understanding misinformation, being able to spot misinformation, but it has to do with like challenging power, authority, being able to understand power structures, and therefore resist issues like media bias and prejudice, for example, and how certain groups are represented or misrepresented in the media. Knowledge of the digital environment is also very important, which has to do with understanding the broader digital ecology within which these technologies operate. So it's not just about evaluating content, but understanding the business practices of corporations like Meta, for example, the privacy implications of how they collect data, some of the things that relate to filter bubbles, for example. So in a nutshell, understanding the broader power structures that have to do with how digital technologies are deployed, utilized, and governed. And then the final aspect has to do with, in my mind, it always has to do with like society at large, democracy. So understanding the broader implications of these technologies, the benefits, the downsides, not just for the individual user as such, but for society at large. So understanding, for example, some of the risks that these technologies present for democracy, some of the problems that misinformation present for for a public debate, for example, as well as understanding the potentials you will notice, like I have discussed this in my own work, that the critical and the functional go hand in hand. These are not, separate components that never intersect. On the contrary, they intersect quite a lot. Even when it comes to just, evaluating online content, which a person would traditionally placed within the criticality box, you realize that besides other dimensions like having contextual knowledge or trusting reputable outlets so that you can verify information, knowing which sources may be more reliable than others. You also need to deploy a number of functional, different functional and critical aspects of your digital literacy. You will need some tangible, practical skills in order to search for information, being able to, use a search engine, understand you need to understand the affordances of those search engines, how algorithms, and then you also need to understand all of those affordances in ways that are also connected with a critical understanding of the digital environment. So understanding also what it means for corporations to use algorithms, for example, how those algorithms align with their business models, how the information that you're presented with is not neutral, but it's also presented to you in line with your own pre-existing beliefs, hence the problem of the filter bubble, which in itself undermines your ability to evaluate content, because you're not exposed to a wide range of sources as you normally would when you're presented with information that is similar and is similar to what you already like and what the platforms think you're gonna enjoy encountering anyway, right? So that's what I mean when I said that the functional and the critical come together, and they converge in a lot of different instances, in a lot of different ways. This is just an example that has to do with evaluating content, which in itself, yes, is a critical practice, but one that also very much relies on functional digital literacy. So criticality is crucial to media literacy. As I said, traditionally, historically, it sits within media studies and media literacy studies. However, some approaches, you'll find them in the literature, have privileged the functional more, sometimes the functional over the critical. And you find that, for example, in not all, but some digital inclusion research and interventions that tend to focus on what do people need in order to be digitally included. Oh, they need, access to digital technologies. They need to have the basic skills to be able to, apply for a job, right? And so you can see how the functional sometimes is promoted over the critical. Unfortunately, in the current national curriculum for England, arguably, there is more of an emphasis on the functional, and you see that in subjects like computing, for example, with emphasis on practical and coding skills. And part of the reason why there has been a recent review of the national curriculum, and one of the decisions has been to embed media literacy more firmly in the curriculum, and we'll see how that happens now in the next few years or so, but has been precisely because that criticality wasn't strongly embedded in the curriculum as it should have been. And oftentimes, functional digital literacy is linked to these courses that have to do with employment, workforce, and the economy, right? So, it's easier to measure functional skills, and those functional skills are seen as very, very useful for being able to feed into the economy, get a job, and boost the economy. So these are important arguments that have traditionally gravitated around media literacy. I would argue that a lot of these things apply to AI literacy, and that if you are promoting AI literacy, we don't want to end up kind of making the same mistakes over again. I mean, that's something I would just disclaim at this point. So what about the critical? The critical is essential. Critical digital literacy is important for participating in society. Critical pedagogy is one. Research informed by critical pedagogy has, for example, done extensive work on the critical. And, there are lots of questions that we can address there, and we can debate around, for example, how much do we politicize the critical? Because the question of the critical oftentimes is actually very much linked to broader issues of power and ideology. So there are, there's always there a risk of politicizing it too much, or not politicizing it enough, and those are big ontological issues, I would say. So how about AI literacy in itself as a distinct concept, if it is a distinct concept? Then I think it's fair to argue that since 2020, 2021, research and new frameworks have sort of mushroomed when it comes to the academic literature. AI literacy has been defined by several scholars, including by Long McGargo, who have defined it as the competencies that enable individuals to critically evaluate AI technology. So it's really reassuring to see that the critical is there, at least in this, in mainstream definitions. It's also, I think, fair to say that much of the work has focused so far on educational settings, primarily educators, teachers, students, different key stages, less on the workplace and even less on the public at large. Most approaches tend to privilege a sort of cognitive and individualistic approach to AI literacy. So AI literacy is often understood as, incorporating a set of different skills and knowledge that are relevant to the individuals. And some of these competence, yes, do relate to the importance of critically evaluating outputs. And we are seeing, and I think that's reassuring, how critical questions of ethics are becoming increasingly integral and increasingly embedded within understandings of AI literacy. And that's something that I would argue is in itself novel, because oftentimes with media literacy, I think research questions of ethics are sort of sat alongside questions of competences, with media literacy focusing primarily on competences, whether we're actually seeing with AI literacy frameworks that ethics is becoming more and more intertwined with those competences, and it's a primary, and it takes to have a primary role within those frameworks. And that's perhaps expected given some of the big problems and ethical problems that AI technologies do raise and exacerbate, perhaps. So an approach that is, I think, quite popular and referred to in literature is the one developed by Ing and colleagues, looking at particularly four domains: know and understand, use and apply, evaluate and create, with AI ethics sort of cutting through all of those dimensions. You can see how these dimensions relate to different things. So you have know and understand has to do with understanding the basics of AI applications. Use an AI is where when you apply knowledge and concepts. Evaluate and create, it's a higher order thinking skills, and that's where you start thinking more critically about AI technologies, and you also deploy creative skills in order to redesign, recreate, those technologies for societal good. That's what they talk about in their work. And then AI ethics, as I said, it kind of cuts across all of those dimensions. And what they do in their work, that they use Bloom's taxonomy, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with this. It's a hierarchy, it's a pyramid of different kind of skills and competences, from remembering, which is the kind of the foundational, more basic one, all the way up to creating, with evaluating being really important and sort of conducive to then also creating things that can have a positive outcome. And and when you think about those different stages, particularly in relation to AI, then you see how those different categories correspond to very specific skills, knowledge areas, basically. I'll go. Let's continue now with another part of this presentation, which has to do with why are we even talking about media literacy? Why are we? I think we all agree that it's important, but why is it important? In just a nutshell, I wanted to say, in a few words, why, in my mind, it's really important to and always ensure that we promote media literacy in ways that allow different populations to thrive in a rapidly changing society. Protection and empowerment is traditionally the word that has been used. I'd like to use participation rather than empowerment, which is perhaps a little bit more contested. But protection and participation are two complementary paradigms, and I think they really capture the importance of media literacy. On the one hand, media literacy is often praised for enabling users and people to protect themselves from online risks, right? And another word I could be using here is harms, but risks and harms are not necessarily the same thing. Now, you'll see that in a country like the UK, for example, there is a protectionist emphasis when it comes to promoting media literacy in policy discourses. It's not just all about, but it's primarily about online harms and being able to, develop coping strategies and being able to know what to do or how to being able to avoid harms altogether. The assumption there is that if you know how to identify some of these risks, then you may be able to find ways to cope with them. And that is something that you find in, that very much relates to a concept that is sort of that overlaps with media literacy, which is the concept of digital resilience. Participation, on the other hand, it's about being able to participate through those skills and knowledge and aptitudes that you need to have to participate in society. And by participation, I don't mean just civic and political, although that obviously is super important. I mean all areas of life, being able to, apply for a job, being able to communicate with friends, being able to travel, to have fun, being able to participate in civic and political processes. Obviously, this type of participation is important for digital inclusion, and digital and social inclusion go hand in hand. So those two paradigms, participation, protection, and participation, are two sides of the same coin. And very briefly, three case studies based on work that I've done in the last few years. We can see that they're part of the same coin, part of the same two sides of the same coin. When thinking, for example, about what survivors of modern slavery need in the UK in order to reintegrate into society. On the one hand, this is based on work we did at the University of Liverpool a few years ago. On the one hand, they need media literacy to protect themselves from some of the online harms that exist with social media. And for them, those harms are much more acute, because re-trafficking, is a potential harm that exists for specific vulnerable populations like them. But on the other hand, media literacy is essential in order to participate in life, communicate with friends and family, but more importantly, again, for them, being this a vulnerable group, accessing support services and being able to get the legal support they need, the health support they need, or translation, all the different aspects that really are essential for their integration in society, in UK society. Case study 2, another vulnerable population, children aged 9 to 11. This is based on a project that I completed some time ago, which has to do with the evaluation of a media news literacy program. What stood out from this evaluation is that children do need media and news literacy in order to be able to navigate content critically. And that means misinformation, scams, and things like this. But on the other hand, also, we found a very positive link between news literacy and civic engagement, meaning that, the more children develop media and news literacy, the more likely they are to also feel connected with others in their communities, the more likely they are to be civically aware of what goes on around them, to take part in acts of service like volunteering, for example, and they have a disposition to participate in society as grown-up adults as well. And then another case study, this is not with a vulnerable group. On the contrary, this is an elite population, activists and political advocates. This is based on research where I was looking at, the intersection of media, digital literacy, and civic and political engagement. On the one hand, media literacy allows them to overcome very strategically some of those risks, like misinformation, privacy violations, including through what I've termed strategic disengagement. So this deliberate withdrawal from using certain platforms at certain times in certain ways, so as to avoid certain harms and certain risks. And at the same time, media literacy very important for their ability to participate in society, civically, politically, engaging with news stories, sharing public debate, content, accessing content, campaigning, and raising awareness. So, yeah, I've talked about three, populations, two vulnerable populations, one elite population. Now, what about the UK population as such, right? So I'd like to really focus on the UK as a case study. And unfortunately, it's really clear that there are gaps in children's media and AI literacy, and also in adults' media and AI literacy in this country. We have Ofcom's longitudinal research, yearly research that shows what levels, but also what gaps exist when it comes to that. Their latest report about children was published just not long ago, and this shows that a lot of children and young people are using AI. But 4 in 10 would trust AI generated news article as much as or more than those written by humans, which I do find pretty alarming. Also, for example, 31% are confident but unable to assess the trustworthiness of a social media profile. They use performance measures in their longitudinal research, which is great, and and that really shows that there is a discrepancy, in as much as sometimes people tend to be actually overconfident and they're not as skilled as they think they are when it comes to spotting misinformation. And equally, there are gaps also in their knowledge of when it comes to identifying advertising, for example, Or also, for example, 25% of 13 to 17-year-olds are confident but unable to identify an AI-generated image. When it comes to adults, equally, there are gaps in their media and AI literacy skills. 54% of adults report using AI tools. However, 34% are confident but unable to identify paid advertising online. More than 25% are unable to spot fake social media profiles. Almost 20% believe that if a website appears in a search, on a search engine, then it will contain accurate information by default. And only 44% feel confident deciding whether online content is produced by a person or AI. So now I'd like to complement these findings with some very preliminary findings that we are gathering from one of the two projects that were mentioned at the beginning. A project that I'm co-leading with colleagues from the University of Birmingham. This is funded by IDA, and it's co-led with two colleagues of mine. And as part of this project, we're exploring benefits and risk of using AI chatbot use for 18 to 25-year-olds in the UK, with a focus on their mental health and well-being, really. And the ambition here is to develop, the goal here is to develop evidence-based and practical recommendations for safe and ethical AI use. So what are we doing as part of this project? A systematic literature review, online survey, focus groups, and co-design workshops. I'm going to draw on some of the very, very preliminary findings. So these have to be, let's look at this with caution in as much as, we're potentially still recruiting other participants. For the time being, we've collected 946. We might recruit a few, we might get a few more responses. We've used Prolific, so we've administered an online survey, but we've done with using Prolific and their online panel, and we did so though using stratified quota sampling to sort of mimic the target population in the UK, particularly when it comes to specific variables like age, gender, ethnicity, and whether or not they are in higher education. So some of these preliminary findings, which I think some of these are really exciting, and some of them are potentially alarming perhaps, but let's just look at this together. So some of the so for those participants who have used AI chatbots specifically, because though they are presented with a question about AI literacy that focuses specifically on AI chatbots, right? And so you can see the items we're using on the left side, and you can see the question, which is on the right side: to what extent do you agree with the following statements about your understanding of and ability to engage with AI chatbots? Some of the things that I'm finding interesting, let's say, is, for example, and this is just some basic descriptive statistics. We will be doing some more fancy statistics later on, but these are just some initial findings. So, almost 4 in 10 don't necessarily have, they don't necessarily express a strong level of agreement with avoiding, entering sensitive information into AI chatbots, which obviously suggests that, there are issues there around privacy and perhaps either negligence or gaps in knowledge and when it comes to that. But also I can recognize when AI generated responses appears to be incorrect or made up. You have, again, like more than 4 in 10 respondents not really expressing a large or very large agreement with that kind of statement. We do know that there are issues with self-reporting, and we do know that people tend to be even more, to be overconfident. So in practice, the gap could actually be wider than that. Then, of course, there are other items, like I know that AI chatbots can reproduce or amplify existing bias in society. You can see there again that almost 5 in 10 don't necessarily don't necessarily express a level of agreement in terms of this kind of knowledge, or even worse when it comes to understanding the taking into account and understanding that training in using AI consumes energy and may have environmental impacts. People that do not use AI chatbots are presented with an AI literacy question, which is about AI tools more broadly. And the concept, the term AI tools is defined in the survey, because obviously AI can refer to a bunch of different things. But this is just to say that this question is for those who do not use chatbots as such, but they still obviously engage with AI in different forms. And this is the AI literacy question that we're asking them, which is similar to the other one, but doesn't focus on AI chatbots as such. And you can see again here that when it comes, for example, to recognizing when an outcome generated by AI powered tool appears to be incorrect or made up, there is a significant proportion of respondents who, do not necessarily express a high level of agreement with that kind of statement. But therefore, which basically says that they don't necessarily believe that they do that, or that they're capable of doing that, right? That they have the skills to do that. Equally, when it comes to, I know that AI-powered tools can reproduce or amplify existing biases in society, we can say there is, again, a gap there in knowledge and skills, and the same thing goes for environmental impacts. Now, what I found really interesting is that if we collapse if we collapse all those different responses, particularly for the AI chatbot literacy question, and we're looking at differences in gender, we will see here with these responses that whereas female respondents tend to sort of be more likely to basically to recognize kind of like limits in their own skills. Their male counterparts are the ones who tend to say large or very large, to agree, so to express a higher level of agreement with those statements which have to do with skills and knowledge than their female counterparts, which could signal something that we already know from the literature, that male respondents tend to be overconfident. Now, obviously, we cannot know that for sure, because this would need to be coupled with a performance test or some sort of performance measure in order to really ascertain this kind of insight. But I think it's interesting to see that there's definitely a discrepancy there. And the same thing goes also for the other, for the AI literacy question. So for those respondents that do not use chatbots as such, but they engage with AI more broadly. When it comes, we also have in this survey, we also have a few questions about attitudes, really, because we wanted to kind of also get a sense of whether respondents have sort of like more positive or negative attitudes towards AI. So this question is for those using AI chatbots specifically, and you can see that there is a recognition that AI chatbots are positive in some ways. They're useful for learning new things. You can see that there's a significant proportion of respondents strongly agreeing with that statement. Also, that AI chatbots provide social benefits when used responsibly, and although there is much, you can see that there is much more kind of, there is no clear, it's not a clear cut over there, that there is much more of a attention, and then also the AI chatbots can be very helpful for, they can make everyday task easier. So you see almost like 55% strongly agree with the statement. Interestingly, but perhaps also unsurprisingly, people that do not use AI chatbots, and we do have a bunch of other questions in the survey around why they're not using, those tools, and we haven't looked at the data just yet, but it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of it. But interestingly, those that do not use AI chatbots tend to have, at least from when it comes to looking at this question and the responses, more negative attitudes towards it. I think it's fair to argue that you can see that they, the first statement, it's about how useful it is. If you compare proportions, you can see that, fewer people strongly agree with that statement. But equally, when it comes to AI-powered tools make me feel better about myself, almost 72% of people think not at all, right? And that's a very different finding when it comes to people using chatbots. Equally, AI-powered tools pose a threat to society. There is less people strongly. There's more people strongly agreeing with that kind of statement. Equally, I spent too long interacting with AI-powered tools. Almost 60% they say not at all, and that's not surprising because they don't choose AI chatbots as such. And arguably, chatbots are the most interactive tools when it comes to using AI, right? And interactions with AI-powered tools feel mechanical and robotic. Half of them, 50%, strongly agree with that kind of statement, which, we didn't have that kind of finding from people that use AI chatbots. And if we group those answers, if we group the answers of people if we're looking at negative attitudes specifically, and we're comparing male and female, and we're looking at, at the responses from people that don't use AI chatbots as such. So, and we try and compare responses by gender. What we see here also very interestingly is that female participants tend to have more negative attitudes than their male counterparts. You can see that specifically in relation to certain items, like, you know, the idea that AI tools are making people more intellectually lazy, or that they could pose a threat to society, or that, you know, using them can be quite tiring or stressful, or that using them feels quite mechanical and robotic. And then one more question that we also added to the survey, which I think is really interesting, and I wanted to just add it to this presentation, is around, you know, AI literacy development, really. And this is for, you know, all participants, both the ones that use chatbots and the ones that do not. And the question we asked here was, where does your knowledge of AI mainly come from? And as you can see from the very first most popular responses, we're talking about informal learning here, really, right? And that doesn't come as a surprise, because we know also in the media literacy space that, you know, a lot of the skills and knowledge that people develop are developed informally, organically, through conversations with others. So we have conversations with friends and families. More importantly, we have informal online content created by other users, which I think raises a lot of issues and a lot of problems, if you will, and social media as well. And then also conversations with friends and family and online communities or forums. I want to unpack this further, but, you know, we can discuss that after the presentation. I'd be happy to. So then let's really talk about, so we're moving towards the sort of like final chapters, if you will, of this presentation. We've talked about gaps, and we've talked about levels of media literacy and AI literacy among the UK population, and I've drawn on some of my own previous work to also make some of the present some arguments about the importance of media literacy. Now, when it comes to promoting media literacy, media digital and, you know, literacies in the UK, there are some key challenges. One is the lack of consistent formal education. 2 has to do with a vibrant yet under-resourced civil society sector. 3 has to do with, you know, limited robust evidence of what works. And the 4th one, I'd say, is these joint policy efforts, right? So I'm going to briefly talk about each one of them. Provision is patchy, and that's something we found ourselves through some work that was funded by Ofcom just not long ago. And we know that, also from Ofcom, that only 23% of UK children report having had regular media literacy lessons. This is in their latest report. We also know that media literacy is not firmly embedded in the curriculum, which is why, at least promisingly, the recent review of the curriculum has argued very categorically that media literacy has to be embedded more firmly, and that's going to be subject to revising the curriculum. We also know that revising the curriculum isn't enough, because educators need also support, especially through resources and training. That the education landscape is made complicated by these new technologies, and that teachers oftentimes lack the confidence they need to use these technologies, as found by the Department for Education through a survey in 2025. At the same time, while there are issues with formal education, we do have a very vibrant civil society sector that sort of compensates for some of the gaps and issues that are presented by inconsistent formal education. We have a lot of charities doing work on the ground. In practice, though, there are pockets of good practice. We can't say that that kind of work happens consistently everywhere. This is not how it is. There are different networks, different pockets, and some of them are more advanced at regional level than others. Oftentimes, though, civil society organizations, they need to rely on funding, and the funding is very limited. They cannot run long-term projects. There is also limited national coordination of what these efforts look like, and all the different practices that take place in the civil society sector as such. We also know that a lot of the interventions that are taking place, not all of them are evaluated, or at least robustly evaluated, really. We know that there's a vast array of educational resources, but we don't know much or necessarily about uptake or effectiveness. And the robust evaluation that I'm talking about, methodologies like randomized control trials, for example, longitudinal studies, can be expensive to implement, and they're not always easy to implement. At the same time, there's been a lot of progress when it comes to the policy dimensions of media literacy provision, and I've been very pleased to see that, because since 2003, Ofcom has been given the primary role of promoting media literacy in this country in different ways, including through their research, work on the ground, liaising with different actors. And this role was reinforced later on by through the online media literacy strategy and the online safety Literacy Act. Yeah, they remain department. There are still department silos in terms of different government departments working on media literacy, with DSCMS and then DSET working on media literacy, but DFE. For quite some time, their role was quite undefined, was quite unclear, and media literacy, as you can see from the Online Safety Act in itself. I mean, the title of it is often approached in a rather protectionist way. Now, some promising recent steps exist. As I said, for example, the review of the national curriculum is an example of that, and now the question is a question of implementation. How is it going to be revised? What comes with it? Is it, are teachers going to be trained, supported? And then also we've seen more coordinated efforts involving different departments. For example, a media literacy action plan was published a few months ago in the UK, and this was published by DSET along with DCMS and the FE, and there is a recognition there that more coordination needs to happen. I wouldn't say that document is in itself, that spells out a clear vision or spells out exactly who should be doing what, and it doesn't allocate resources as such or anything, but it's at least, I reckon, it's a first step towards, it's a first step in the right direction. So I'll really finish with three very concise recommendations based on some of the things that I've argued. The first is that media literacy should be made mandatory and yes, embedded more robustly across the curriculum, and promoted as incorporating AI literacy, because my impression, having looked at the the outcome of the independent review of the curriculum, is that that review seems to talk about media literacy and AI literacy as two separate things, and it almost seems to me that AI literacy seems to carry a more functional connotation, whereas media literacy now, is actually reduced to misinformation and criticality, even though media literacy is actually even more than that. So I'd like to see more there in terms of really also reconciling those differences, but also ensuring that AI literacy and media literacy are promoted in tandem. Recommendation number 2, revising the curriculum is not gonna be enough unless, as I said already earlier, more and better support is provided to teachers in order to be able to feel confident in delivering media literacy education, having the training they need, and access to evaluated and robust resources. And then final recommendation, we do need a more comprehensive framework, building on the recent media literacy action plan, spelling out really clearly how and who government departments, civil society, industry should be doing what, and allocating resources accordingly. And the final recommendation, actually, so it's 4 recommendations, sorry, that goes with it, is that also more government funding will be needed if we are to support civil society initiatives and interventions, as well as research and evaluations, which are really important. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Gianfranco, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thanks.
Can we do a round of applause? I've just got a little bit at the end to say. So we've got an attendee survey that Diana will share. We've got Dan at the University of Frankfurt next month. He's talking about co-constructing critique, and that's about social explainable AI and critical computational literacy. So that's going to be like diving even deeper into this idea of criticality. And so yeah, please come along to our next seminar. Thank you so much. We will get hold of Franco's presentation, and then we will share that out with you, because it had so many wonderful links within it. And then we'll all say goodbye and have a lovely afternoon, evening, morning, or whatever it is that is in your time zone.